This is part 2 of working with mind. If you missed the first part, I'll give a little synopsis. And as Laura is alluding, I have found myself struggling at times, and I imagine that some of the rest of us do also, with all that's going on and how to kind of work with all the thoughts that keep cooking up about that. So we'll be exploring that together. And yeah, I'll say more about that later. So first we'll meditate for a bit, and I'll offer a bit of guidance. So it will be a familiar guidance to some of you. Our meditation is an embodied practice for quite a number of reasons. And when we first sit to meditate, it's easy to notice how disconnected we can be from our bodies. We live so much of our time in our heads, in our conceptual minds. So the invitation as we begin our meditation practice is, first of all, to tune in directly to this physical body. Feeling this body here. Feeling the feet on the floor. Ideally flat on the floor, not crossed. Feeling the buttocks on the chair, the seat. And the invitation is to sit in a way such that the spine is upright, not stressed or strained to get in some particular posture, but just sort of stacked with the vertebrae stacked on top of one another. So they can rest there without any particular strain or effort on our part. And so you might take a moment as you begin this meditation, and indeed any meditation, and just move back and forth a little bit, like lean a little forward, lean a little back, maybe a little bit to the side. And just experiment with where's the place of balance where this spine is upright and not strained. And it's the same reason for the feet flat on the floor and say the arms not crossed, to really reduce any sense of pressure or strain in the body. So just to give yourself permission to explore just for a moment with wiggling, maybe leaning a little back and forth or sideways, and just see if the spine has a desire to be in some particular way of balance. And include in that the neck, maybe moving the head from side to side, the chin up and down a little bit. Relaxing the jaw. Relaxing the arms and hands. And just enjoying what it feels like to simply be here. Awake, upright, present, relaxed. You've heard me often quoting Ajahn Suchito, who reminds us that our spiritual practice and our meditation practice is always, always one of bringing skillful conditions to bear. Noting, making much of, expanding, dwelling in skillful conditions. And letting them have their effect to dislodge unskillful habitual patterns. Bringing skillful conditions to bear. So we start with the body, bringing skillful conditions to bear in this body. And we'll explore together throughout the evening what kinds of skillful conditions, mental conditions there might be that we can bring to bear with all that arises in our daily lives. We all know the experience of mental conditions that generate unskillful experience, emotions, anxiety, stress, worry, shame, recrimination, judgment. Thoughts of why didn't, who did, I should have, what if. So we can notice those unskillful and unhelpful thoughts. Again, there's a difference between simple discernment and the kinds of weighted thought and judgment and criticism that our thoughts often offer us. So in this meditation, we're just practicing engendering perceptions that have different flavors to them, learning, allowing ourselves to practice dwelling in a happiness and an ease, in skillful perceptions, skillful thoughts, without having to make anything out of them, without, for example, having to like act in any particular way. One of the important invitations is to cultivate perceptions and thoughts that give rise to gratitude, devotion, contentment, feeling pleased, making much of, drinking in, rejoicing, enjoying. This, we are invited, is the platform for our meditation practice. Not struggling to get somewhere, allowing ourselves to be present with ease, with wholesome qualities of mind and heart. Living in encouragement, feeling grateful. So as we begin the meditation, bring to mind, recollect, maybe letting it arise from your heart, where an image might get generated. Not just a thought, but what is it like to experience one of those qualities, like gratitude or safety or warmth or gladness? See if you might allow an image or a particular memory to arise. But then don't get lost in the story. Allow that memory to help you touch into the feeling quality of gladness in whatever flavor of gladness. It doesn't have to be big or perfect. It doesn't have to be fancy or, quote, spiritual. It could be some very ordinary gladness of mind and heart that allows you to touch into the feeling quality of that in your body. I was out walking early this morning and felt such gladness as the trash trucks were roaring by, and the gentlemen in the trucks were like hopping about, taking care of our neighborhood with all sorts of wonderful energies. I felt enormously grateful, and I can feel the quality of that as I remember that moment. Find something for you too. Let the resonance of it, the felt sense of it, be fully sensed. So it's much more than just a thought or an idea. Experience what it's like to dwell in that. Stay with it. Sense into the ability of the mind to linger, slow down, and dwell in that gladness. Whatever brings up a quality of gladness, gratitude, safety, ease, happiness. Lingering in the felt sense, in the body's experience of that goodness. Breathing with it, breathing into it, enjoying. If you lose a sense of it, let the mind help you remember the moment, the image, or perhaps something else will arise. Mm. Maybe hearing goodness from others, maybe some sense of words that were kindly spoken to you, something that was offered for your welfare, where nothing was expected back. Allowing ourselves to practice receiving, not requiring some performance, some standard, Simply allowing ourselves to receive these small moments of goodness and gladness, if and as and when they arise. And then dwelling in the goodness. We don't have to deserve it or pay it back. We don't have to be worthy. Things have been offered. We have received. Might we delight? May we be nourished by gladness. May we give ourselves permission to linger, to receive. May all beings be nourished by gladness. So this is part 2 of a talk on working with mind. This is what I wrote about it that you read probably before you came tonight. Recent events and much of popular culture invite us relentlessly to wander off and then hide out in the rabbit holes of mental chatter, confusion, strong emotion, and familiar though unhelpful thought patterns. Our daily practice invites us to step out of those patterns of thought and pause into awareness and curiosity, ongoing investigation and choice toward what is most wise and loving, though perhaps less familiar. Does anybody recognize what I'm speaking of in terms of, recent events and much of popular culture invite us to wander? Is it just me? Is it anybody? Yeah. Yeah. There's just so much chatter that can fill our minds and really make it hard to wash the dishes, much less meditate or have a spiritual practice. So my last talk was looking at just the limitations of thought, just even from a psychological or a neuropsychological point of view. Um, that that and emotion, which is very often strongly driven by our thinking minds, so that we can make ourselves quite miserable um, by adding all sorts of thought to our bodily experience. And so we talked last time about emotion and thinking and the limitations of those, which can be quite an insult to our thinking minds because our thinking minds tend to think that they are really in charge of everything. Um, I think I think of it. I was thinking it's sort of like, we have this little Twitter feed in our heads, and it just keeps spitting out all this information without any real recognition of whether or not it's true, whether or not it's current, whether or not it's actually helpful. We can get all twisted in a knot about external Twitter feeds, but we don't get quite so we believe the one that's kind of constantly sputtering away in our heads. I was telling somebody the other day that it was a while ago now, but it was striking because it was so remarkable. I had one of those plastic ice cube trays, and in the process of trying to get the ice cubes out of it, I broke it. And I watched my internal Twitter feed say, "You always ruin everything." You know? Now, if I believe that, if I listen to it, which of course we often do, huh? We listen to it without really discerning, then I'm going to have kind of a miserable day and not really know quite what to do with my ice cubes. This is Mariana Kaplan. She says, we, whoever we imagine ourselves to be, are not the ones thinking our thoughts. Our minds are endlessly repeating habitual thought forms that result from familial, cultural, and karmic conditioning, all with numerous feedback loops feeding into and continually reconditioning one another. And again, we can kind of know, it's like, where did that come from? I always ruin everything. So, surely it was not from one of you who would have stood next to me and told me that. So the challenge is training our minds to be wise and peaceful and loving and tranquil and happy, no matter what our experience is. And also being discerning about the information that our little internal Twitter feed gives us. When our minds are well trained, Andrew Holicek tells us, then whatever we say and do will naturally turn into healthy and beneficial words and deeds for ourselves and others. This is because our experiences are the fruits of the habitual seeds we have sown in our mental soil. Okay? So we can practice the way we did in the meditation, and we can practice in daily life with our daily ice cube trays. So we're training our minds to see the arisings and to cultivate skill in being with it all, no matter what. Nevertheless, we have a tendency to try to use conceptual thought in ways that keep us tied to suffering in order to reject what is difficult or painful. I can look at my ice cube tray example. It's like, what was I trying to avoid with that thought? To grasp onto something solid for comfort and security, and to try to desensitize ourselves so that we don't have to feel the whole problem of impermanence and pleasure and pain and gain and loss at all. So we can use our thoughts to try to desensitize ourselves from just the normal ups and downs and the experience of how it is to be human on this planet. So we also tend to identify with our very limited thinking mind. I talked last week about how minuscule, actually, the amount of information is that reaches our conscious mind compared to the 10 million neurons at this exact moment that are firing for each of us. And that Tim Wilson says that we can be conscious of 40 of those 10 million at any given moment. And so we tend to identify with our conscious mind as though that's the whole story. And we forget that it's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of our capacity and of the information that's actually available to us. So note that we're not saying the thinking mind is bad. It's just more limited than we want to imagine. And it really is hard to imagine because, in particular, maybe our Western culture, we are so oriented to conceptual mind. And so, if you will, addicted to our conceptual minds, that we have a tendency to think that that's all there is. Sort of like, there's something going on externally in the world that's very similar, where, what I think is true, and that's all the information that there is. So our conceptual minds just do that to us all the time. So it's not at all unusual for our thoughts to lie to us. It was not probably truthful for my thought to say, I always ruin everything. It's not unusual for our thoughts to lie to us, to tell us seriously outdated or grossly partial or sometimes outright wrong information gleaned from others when we were young, who taught us to believe ideas that were simply wrong. So it's not unusual for our thoughts to lie to us. So we need to, we need to kind of know that just because our thoughts say you should be ashamed of that, that it's not necessarily true. The truly amazing thing to me is that the Buddha came to see all of this without benefit of modern neuroscience. So in terms of the 10 million neurons firing and the only 40 of them that we're conscious of, he in his practice actually saw that and said, oh, well, this gives us lots more information. And it's the basis of Kalu Rinpoche's famous quote, "We live in illusion and the appearance of things." We live in illusion and the appearance of things. And we get addicted to the illusions and the appearance of things. So we're training our minds to see all of these conceptual arisings as valuable. When I leave tonight, I will be able to find, I hope, my own car. No, it's my husband's car. But I'll be able to find that. So that my conceptual mind is useful for a whole bunch of things, but it's not as important as my conceptual mind likes to think it is. So our practice, our practice is releasing the clinging that we have to our ways of organizing information that lead to and keep us bound in suffering. So as Ajahn Suchita says, the practice, why we practice is to cultivate the capacity to reliably bring skillful conditions to bear with whatever is going on. So thinking, if I take it all too personally, if I identify too closely, if I cling too tenaciously to the brain's way of organizing and explaining things that happen, if I cling to predicting the future, if I cling to the brain's way of organizing things, making them in my mind more real and true and permanent and solid than they actually are, I will suffer. If I believe my mind's opinion that I always ruin everything, I will suffer. And we all have examples of those sorts of things. So through our meditation practice, we learn to see these patterns. So we learn, first of all, to simply see them. I actually mercifully, in that moment, was able to do exactly what you did. Uh-huh. Yeah. I say, sweetheart, whatever, but, yeah. I was able to see it. But we can also see the places where we get caught. Somebody was talking to me today about the news, who was quite caught in it. So we can see the caughtness of it. Somebody else was talking to me a little bit ago about anger arising. Caught. A lot of shame about the anger. Somebody had called me and talked to me about that. So we can begin to see the caughtness. Because we can have an idea that I shouldn't be caught, that's just another, it's just another Twitter feed. It isn't Twitter anymore, but it's easier to say that. It's just another feed, to say I shouldn't be caught. If I were a better spiritual practitioner, I wouldn't be caught. It's not true. So we see it, we cultivate the ability to see those places where we get caught in a mind rut of some sort. We recognize that they're constructed. my thought about the ice cube tray was constructed, right? I didn't come in as a baby with the thought that I always ruin everything. Somewhere along the lines that got constructed. Don't know why or how. Well, I can guess a couple things, but anyway. But even that, it's just like, okay, my mind can kind of write a whole biography where I actually don't really exactly know. But that's not the point. The point is, how do I be skillful with this? And for starters, we see it as just a mind thing. When we directly experience, when we practice with our meditation and with our spiritual practice to be directly in experience, when we work to turn our attention directly to our experience, the first thing that happens is likely to be I don't know, confusion, nothing to see here, So that confusion and bewilderment about what else do I do if I'm not going to follow this train of thought. The first thing that happens when we ask that question is very likely to be confusion. And it makes sense, doesn't it? If we're stepping out of the habitual pattern and the brain's habitual way of seeing things, it makes sense. It's like Laura was saying, in Germany, you're in Germany. I don't know where the subway is, I don't know. I'm in new territory. So first of all, to let go of identification. And secondly, to allow the experience of confusion or bewilderment. And that can be quite challenging because it can kind of last a little bit. That sense of confusion. When we're with something uncertain, bewilderment, befuddlement, disorder, commotion, cluttering, disarranging, stirring up, unsettling, puzzlement, our practice invites us to practice touching into those moments, freshness and without prejudice. Notice even in the pause, when we pause, that it's not uncommon for our brains to kind of go, what's happening here? Is she all right? What's going to happen next? That our brains don't like that kind of uncertainty. So we can practice allowing it. Allowing the experience of not knowing without I was going to say without the brain coming in and saying, well, you should know. Or maybe it's this, or maybe it's that. Maybe she's having a brain fart, Maybe she forgot what she was going to say. Maybe she doesn't know what she's going to that. Yes. But that notice that when we step out of that train, when we step out of identification, the first thing that tends to happen is confusion. Can we allow that? You've heard me say a zillion times, because it's one of my favorite quotes, Mingyur Rinpoche's quote, confusion, I was taught, is the beginning of understanding. The first stage of letting go of the neuronal gossip, I love that phrase, little neurons are up there gossiping back and forth. When I pause, Can't you watch your little neurons go start gossiping? You know, they just start gossiping. The first stage of letting go of the neuronal gossip that used to keep you chained to very specific ideas about who you are and what you're capable of. So confusion, I was taught, is a good thing. So our practice involves working to inquire more deeply into our experience. You know, you've heard so many times we have the metaphor of the ocean, and often we just sort of live at the surface of the ocean, this, you know, habitual, the little 40 neurons that are firing. And there's a tremendous amount of information. And it goes through different layers. I mean, some of it is sort of more, I don't know, constructed, psychological, and you know, it goes all the way down to deep awareness, non-dual awareness. You know, a lot more information is available to us, and so we practice with it. I asked you the last time if you had questions to send me questions, and somebody sent me just a brilliant question, and I asked permission, and they said yes, I could repeat it to you. Let me read the question, and then I will offer to you what I think is brilliant about it. What I find hard, parenthesis, me and only me, close parenthesis, is letting myself know what is true without overriding it with my mind. But how? At this moment, I'm thinking of how to give up without giving in or something like that. And I'm going to go ahead and send this question without editing it. So I read it and I practically laughed out loud because it was such a good question. And the person who wrote it didn't realize how on target they were. So what I find hard. Good. Yeah. It's hard. And they were allowing the difficulty. You know, human life is hard. Have you noticed? You know, I've been reading Susan's books. I keep plugging Susan's books. You must read Susan's books. I've been reading Susan's books, and I was just telling her that she writes about she writes novels about the life of the Buddha. They're fascinating, and I've been rereading them. I read them before. I've been rereading them, and I said I was just so it just kind of hits me in the face how naive I am about how idyllic the Buddha's life was and the times were, you know, and it's just really lovely to see life is hard, and here we are, you know. So what I find hard. Yes. And so sometimes we can imagine that if I find something hard, I must be doing something wrong. What if you find something hard? Two things. One is you're alive in human life. And two is you're dropping out of the neuronal gossip and allowing an inquiry. So, number one, yay, what I find hard. Me and only me, little joke they make. You know, it's like, I know this isn't personal. True. True. It's not personal. Huh? We all struggle. None of us has gone far. Who did that quote? I forget. What I find hard is letting myself know what is true without overriding it with my mind. Yeah. Yeah. So the whole thing, they were kind of sitting with it, bowing to the difficulty, recognizing the difficulty, not identifying with it, recognizing the difficulty, which is which is crucial. If we don't do those things, we're going to get caught in identification. This is me. I'm being stupid if I say, this about, I always ruin everything, then, and then you can imagine if I kind of go on the little roller coaster of how did this come about? I mean, how many hours of therapy do I need in order to explore that one? So that if I don't understand those first points, then I'm just not going to allow the difficulty and the non-identification with the difficulty. It's not my fault that it's hard, and it's not my fault that I'm confused. In fact, it's a good thing. Confusion, I was taught, is the beginning of understanding. It's the letting go of the neuronal gossip that keeps us chained. But how, they said. This is where the Buddhist teaching to Maggia comes in. Maggia, there's this sutta. Maggia was the Buddha's attendant, and he was on alms round one morning, and he saw a mango grove, and he thought, that's a really cool mango grove, I could go there. I could just, forget about this monastic life. I could just go there. I could meditate. It's really sweet. It's quiet, peaceful. Everything's lovely. Mangoes all over the place. Everything's great. So he goes to the Buddha and he asks him permission. He says, could I not be your attendant anymore? Could I just go and practice in the mango grove? And the Buddha says, go for it. So he goes off into the mango grove and he sits himself down, and he is overcome with mental states of greed, hatred, and ignorance. He's just like, it's all this stuff is coming up for him. So he goes back to the Buddha and he says, here's what happened. I always ruin everything. And the Buddha says, yeah, it happens. He says, it's like that. He said, the reason it happens is, basically, he says, the reason it happens is you're not enlightened yet, which, of course, McGee already knew. So the reason it happens is that we're not enlightened yet, and then the invitation is how to practice with it. He actually gives a couple of suttas on this. I'm just going to talk about one of them. So he tells McGee, he says, here's how to work with this. So for starters, he says, the first thing to do is, he says, in one whose awareness release is still immature, 5 qualities bring it to maturity. He says, there's the case where you have admirable people as friends, companions, and colleagues. In one whose awareness release is still immature, this is the first quality that brings it to maturity. And this is the other dimension, if you will, of that question that was so beautiful, because, to ask the question of somebody else, how, and I'm going to send this without editing it, is following this instruction, is saying, okay, who's the community who can help me get some perspective on this? I might have come to you to help me laugh when I said I always ruin everything. And so the second thing, he says there are 5 things. He says the second thing, furthermore, you are virtuous. You train yourself, having undertaken the training rules, seeing danger in the slightest faults. In one whose awareness release is still immature, this is the second quality that brings it to maturity. And that's a place of really cultivating wise speech, wise action, wise effort, And we've often spoken here about contemplating your virtues. The Buddha in another sutta talks about contemplating your virtues. Contemplating your virtues. Furthermore, he gets to hear at will, number 3, easily and without difficulty, talk that is truly sobering and conducive to the opening of awareness. Talk on modesty, contentment. Actually, think about our current culture now as I read these, because there is so much talk that is not this, that can make us a little crazy if we pay too much attention to it. Furthermore, talk that is truly sobering and conducive to the opening of awareness. Talk on modesty, contentment, seclusion, non-entanglement, arousing persistence, virtue, concentration, discernment. I'm quoting from the sutta here. Discernment, release, and the knowledge and vision of release, and one whose awareness release is still immature. This is the third quality that brings it to maturity. So contemplating wisdom. How about, where do you find that? In your daily life. Well, for me, actually, I was noticing today, I was a little tired today and a little kind of bored. And so I was noticing, it's like, well, there's always YouTube, and just how seductive it is to go and look at the latest dirt and, in social media. Well, if I don't do that, where do you go? Where do you go to find talk that is modest, content, secluded, non-entangled, arousing persistence, virtue, concentration, discernment, release, and the knowledge and vision of release? Where do you go? Well, that leads us right to number 4, which the Buddha says, furthermore, he keeps his persistence aroused. He's talking to a monk, for abandoning unskillful mental qualities and for taking on skillful qualities. He is steadfast, solid in his effort, not shirking his duties with regard to skillful qualities. So being persistent, showing up, being diligent, willing to just keep practicing. Not requiring, as Andy Olinsky says, not requiring that we get it by Tuesday. And then number 5, furthermore, they are discerning, endowed with the discernment related to arising and passing away, which is to say, things are not permanent. So discerning about impermanence. There's a story that the Buddha told about a man who loved his 5-year-old son very much, and he was away on business, and bandits came and burned the whole village down. And he came back, and his son was gone and dead. And so he mourned and mourned and mourned and mourned, and it was really dreadful. And then soon afterwards, his real son escaped from the bandits and found his way home. He arrived at his father's new cottage at midnight and knocked at the door. The father, still grieving, asked, "Who is it?" The child answered, "It's me, Papa. Open the door." But in his agitated state of mind, convinced that his son was dead, the father thought that some young boy was making fun of him. He shouted, "Go away," and continued to cry. After some time, the child left. Father and son never saw each other again. So after the story, the Buddha said, sometimes, somewhere, you take something to be the truth. If you cling to it so much, even when the truth comes in person and knocks on your door, you will not open it. So 5 strategies, 5 strategies that the Buddha offers. Admirable people, admirable places, as friends and supports, ways to help ourselves. Personal virtue, cultivating, contemplating. That's why I did Ajahn Suchito's Gladdening the Heart meditation, where we practice cultivating wholesome qualities of mind and heart. Talk that is sobering and conducive to the opening of awareness, which also implies abandoning talk that is not. So, Sharon, it is not wise to keep looking at that seductive headline on YouTube. Number 4 is keeping persistence aroused for abandoning unskillful qualities. And with all of these, leading to discernment about what is the right ending of stress. So we pay attention to our minds, our thoughts when they're useful, when they're helping us to relieve suffering, when they tell us that I always ruin everything, that might not be so helpful. Or when they tell us all the who did and who didn't and what if and why don't they and they should and isn't it awful and what's going to happen and what if, all of that kind of thinking that is very unlikely to lead us in a wholesome direction. Final quote from the Buddha. Little thoughts, subtle thoughts, when followed, stir up the heart. Not comprehending the thoughts of the heart, one runs here and there, the mind out of control. But comprehending the thoughts of the heart, and there he's talking again about the wholesome qualities of the heart and mind, one who is ardent, mindful, restrains them. When followed, they stir up the heart. One awakened lets them go without trace. So the invitation is to practice, 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 practice. It's not about going home and then giving ourselves a hard time for not doing it properly, but about letting it be. So that question that that person asked was such a perfect question because it ended with that inquiry. How? What do I need to do to be skillful with this? And what they decided was to be skillful with it was to simply allow the question. And in that particular case, to allow it publicly, send it on to me. Fine, great. But it didn't even need to go that far, but to allow the question and to be curious. So that the whole question was really the teaching. And it was so lovely. It was like, oh, great. I don't have to teach anything. We're good. All right. Well, it's 7:30. It's actually 8:32. So time for us to end. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.